2:30. You've made it this far. Congratulations. Hopefully you're not hitting a slump or caffeinating if you are. You have entered the Rural Accessibility and Sustainable Mobility Research, what are we calling this, track seminar session. Thank you for coming. My name is Abby Blything. I do Sustainable Transportation Programming here at University of Vermont, and I'm delighted to introduce our two presenters today. We have Greg Rowangould from the, he's the director of the Transportation Research Center over there, and wonderful Clare Nelson over here. She's a graduate research assistant, and they will both be presenting today on this topic. So we will let them go through their presentation and then take questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about first 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the TRC, but largely a vision for how research at the university and elsewhere can help inform sustainable transportation decisions and policymaking here in Vermont. And a big part of that being collecting data about actual Vermonters and travel in Vermont. And then Claire is going to talk about some of her work where we do exactly that. So first of all, just TRC real quick. We do a lot. We basically have two major missions. One is serving research needs for the state of Vermont. So VTrans has various things that come to us with the city, CCRPC, and others. And we try to do that to the best of our abilities, regardless of the particular topic. It might be de-icing, it might be snowplow routing, it might be building, different materials, or some sort of policy research. And then nationally, our center is really focused on research on travel behavior and sustainable travel in small and rural communities, right? Because we're here in Vermont, but also it's a massive research gap in the academic literature and just knowledge. So much of the research has been focused on the problems of larger cities, and so they don't always translate to rural places. So I'm going to start with this. Transportation policy research is, I would argue, a critical gap in Vermont. We have lots of climate plans, policies, and goals in Vermont, and this is wonderful. I moved here a few years ago from New Mexico, which when I moved to New Mexico, the governor at that time had banished any mention of climate change from state law and policy. That has since changed, but coming here is so refreshing. There's so much opportunity, so much energy, and I've just got a smattering of different plans and policies, and had various climate goals, and now essentially a law that requires these reductions. However, we just haven't made much progress. Right? Our greenhouse gas emissions are basically where they've been for the last couple, since at least 1990 and probably somewhere before that. We have our aggressive targets, our newest ones, and we're basically not on track to meet these, at least in the very term ones. It's not saying it's impossible, but it's gonna be work. Transportation, as probably everyone in this room knows, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont and most other states, and particularly rural states. So the challenge here, and this is a quotation that comes from a Transportation Research Board study. It's part of the National Academies, that by far, and not surprisingly, most of the research on greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies has focused on metropolitan areas or at the national and state levels. There's very little attention given to non-urban areas. Right? And this is largely because most of what we do, most of what we understand, the data we collect, the policy that guides our decision making, was focused on congestion and air quality problems in large cities. Think about California and LA and smog. Our tools, our models, our methods, and our policy responses largely derived from that. But now we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. They, all of our travel contributes to that, and tackling this in rural areas and smaller communities is just as important as tackling it in large urban places. Depending on how you define rural, half of the transportation in this country is rural or occurring in small cities. And we know so little about that and how people would respond to different types of policy strategies and incentives, whether it's to buy electric vehicles or how they might respond to a tax or a carbon fee or something to travel demand management policy. And so, as I see it, the ideal policy process, at least to an academic, looks something like this, where we have some mitigation goals. The state has set those. We can identify some strategies. That's what the Climate Council has been working on. And we create models and forecasting tools to try to understand how well these strategies will work. We want to look at the cost, the equity, the efficiency. We'll develop some pathways to the future that will get us circles, and we'll implement things. The problem is, and we've hired a number of consultants to help with all these models and forecasting, and they come here and they say, well, you don't have any data from Vermont. You have some models, but they don't quite answer these questions. And so they're doing what they can to use their expertise gathered from other places and to, we make assumptions. And that's where we're at. And so big limitations that we really don't know how Vermonters respond to things. We don't know much about their behavior, how they respond to prices, what goes into decision making on where to live or what vehicles to choose. We don't have a great way to really pin down the potential and the cost effectiveness, the efficiency of our policies, and fully understand the equity implications. But we can do this, right? As we start, we don't need to do the research before we adopt policy, right? It takes forever. We are adopting policies. We have a real opportunity to start collecting data from them. As we implement things, we can be smarter about how we collect data and monitor them. We can then use this data to start updating these models we're using, create new models that take into account how things work in Vermont and understand how Vermonters respond to our policies, understand which strategies and policies are working, which are not, which, are we gonna get there? Do we need to do more? Have we overdone it? And really closing the loop here, bringing in knowledge and learning from our own state, from the behavior of Vermonters is, I think, a critical need. Of course, I advocate that UVM and our Transportation Research Center this is the work that we do nationally. This is the type of thing that excites us and we want to learn about. And it takes a lot of coordination with the state. It takes funding. It takes working with the various advocacy groups, state agencies to know what people are doing and be able to study it, collect the data together, and all be a part of this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claire, and Claire's going to talk about this mileage-based user fee study where we've actually gone and collected some pretty unique data from Vermont, both through surveys and administrative data we've collected.
All right, so hi everybody, my name is Claire, I think you said a few times. And this is the research that I've been working on for the past year or two. So I kind of wanted to start with the big outcome, the big conclusion from my research and break it down for you all after that. So I've been studying mileage-based user fees. Some people might know them as a vehicle miles traveled tax. They have a bunch of different names, a road user charge, all the same thing, all the same beast. And the research that we've been doing found that specifically in Vermont, a mileage-based user fee would be a more equitable and more progressive version of the gas tax. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we found that and why we found it. But in order to assess any policy alternative, it's good to understand what the original policy that you're replacing is. So I'm going to start with, what is the gas tax? We call it a fuels tax because it's actually gasoline and diesel combined, but people kind of colloquially refer to it as the gas tax. And it's a price per gallon of fuel sold. A lot of people think that it's a price per price, that if the price of gas goes up, you're going to pay more in taxes. But that's not how the gas tax works. That's a really common misconception. And also we found feeds into how people feel about alternatives to the gas tax, because they don't actually understand what it fundamentally is. Just for some reference points, in Vermont, people on average pay about $220 a year in gas taxes. So relative to other taxes that you might pay or other annual incomes, this is a smaller portion. Not small for a lot of households, but smaller in reference to other things. So the gas tax was originally invented under this concept of being like a road user charge. They thought, we need a way to charge people for how much they travel on the roads. And back when fuel economies were pretty similar, when this was invented in the early 1900s, it seemed fair to charge people for how much gas they used. Because if you travel 10 miles, you would be paying or you'd be buying as much gas probably as somebody else who traveled 10 miles. As we know today, that is not exactly true. You could be traveling next to someone who is 10 miles per gallon next to you on the highway, and you're in your electric vehicle. You're using totally different amounts of gas. So this gas tax is no longer really proportional to how much people are using the roads. That becomes an issue because this is what's largely used to fund our transportation system. It's the majority of what pays for our transportation funding at the federal and state levels. So a reasonable alternative that people have proposed, this has been talked about across the United States. It's been talked about in 25 other states that have done pilot studies, that have 2 states currently have versions of this, but it's a mileage-based user fee or a VMT tax. This is a price per mile, so it's directly proportional to how much you're traveling on the road, which is kind of getting to that like original issue of why we might want to replace the gas tax. Currently, Vermont is considering a mileage-based user fee for electric and hybrid vehicles only. They're also considering a flat fee and a kilowatt-hour fee to help kind of aid in the transportation funding for the state. So what we wanted to do is look at how reasonable would a mileage-based user fee be in Vermont if we were to implement one? Who would be paying more under a mileage-based user fee compared to how much they pay now? Who would be paying less? Where would those costs be distributed, basically? Because we wanted to answer this question of, is it actually more equitable? So we did that in 2 ways. First, we just asked people how they felt about it. We wanted to know if a mileage-based user fee sounds good to them, if people think that it's generally fair. If it's not fair, what their concerns are with it that we could address with a potential policy. So we did a survey. And the unique thing about this survey was that we allowed people to vote on the policy. We gave them kind of the first vote. They didn't really know anything except what they already knew in their heads. And we asked them, yes or no, would you want a mileage-based user fee to replace the gas tax? We also asked them the same thing for a flat fee, but I'm going to focus on mileage-based user fees for this. We allowed them to vote 2 more times, and in between each vote, they were educated on different things. So from the first vote to the second vote, they were educated on how much it would actually cost them under a mileage-based user fee and a gas tax. And we calculated how much it would cost them. So it was personalized cost estimates based on the vehicle information they provided us in the survey. So this is something that hasn't really been done before in surveys of this type. It was unique. We could see once they're presented with how much this will actually cost them, our estimate of what it would be. How does their vote change? Would they support it? Would they not support it? And then we, after they voted that second time, we educated them about some of the equity concerns with the gas tax and the mileage-based user fee, and also about how mileage would be collected. Because a lot of people, when they hear about this, are like, whoa, privacy concerns. What's going to happen? How are you tracking my mileage? Why do you know where I am all the time? There's a lot of misconceptions with this kind of stuff, and so we thought we'd just give them the information and let them make their own educated decision. So the third and final vote, they know a bit about how it would cost them, they know about some of the equity concerns, and they know about the mileage-based user fee collection options. So this chart here shows how those votes changed across the survey, and they changed dramatically. Once you present people with education, their original vote can basically go in any direction. And so we wanted to look at what factors influence people's policy support. So our big finding from the survey is that from the start to finish, policy support for mileage-based user fees increased by about 11%. That could be accounted for as like the impact of the education we gave them in the survey, from only knowing what they previously know to knowing a lot about mileage-based user fees. You can increase support. We also found that respondents really don't know what the gas tax is. They don't know how it's charged. They don't know what it pays for. This is a big knowledge gap. If you're asking people how they feel about something and they don't even know what they're being asked to replace, that's kind of concerning. So that's something that also we accounted for in the survey by educating them about what the gas tax actually was. We also found that people's attitudes and beliefs, how they feel about different things like the government or like their personal attitudes, have a large impact on how people vote regardless of the policy. Most importantly, and what I'll talk about after this too, is that people felt that a mileage-based user fee would be unfair to folks in rural and low-income areas. This is like one of the biggest kind of issues that people have with a VMT tax, and it's something that we account for I'll talk about in a second. And these perceptions of fairness, how fair or unfair they think it would be, are one of the most consistent reasons why people don't want a mileage-based user fee. So if you can address some of these fairness concerns, you potentially have a really great way to raise policy support. And the last thing is just about the personalized cost estimates that we gave people. It's a great way to change someone's opinion. Regardless of how they feel, if they think that they're going to save money, or if they know that they're going to save money, they're more likely to support something. So there's a lot of misconceptions about who would pay more or less with a mileage-based user fee. By kind of myth-busting some of those things, you can actually get really large raises in policy support. So after we talked to people about how they felt about mileage-based user fees, we wanted to see what would actually happen if we implemented one in Vermont. So we have this really great DMV data with over 500,000 vehicles. We have the odometer readings, we have the addresses, the fuel economies of all these vehicles. So we can do some really robust analysis, both looking at differences in where people would pay based on their community, differences in how people would pay based on their income. So what we did is we calculated how much they currently pay in the gas tax based off of these odometer readings that we have from the end of year vehicle inspections, and then how much they would pay under a revenue neutral mileage-based user fee. Revenue neutral in this case was said, okay, we get this much from the gas tax in Vermont every year. Keeping the same amount of money, what would we need to charge people per mile? And we found that that would be about 2 cents per mile, which is right smack dab in the middle of the range of what every other state has found when they've looked at this. So pretty consistent finding. So we want to see, okay, we know you pay this much now, we know you pay this much under a mileage-based user fee, but who's paying more and who's paying less? How does that change by your location, your income, race and ethnicity, some of these really important equity questions. So we found that a mileage-based user fee would be progressive. In this context, it means that higher income households are paying more than compared to low income households. But generally, costs would increase for everybody at a residential household. The reason for this is because our data only examined residential households. Commercial vehicles are this whole other beast. And so if most residential places are going to be paying a bit more, it means that commercial vehicles would be the ones saving money for the most part. So it is revenue neutral for all vehicles, but looking at just residential vehicles, these ones would be paying a bit more. We also looked at how this would vary across space in Vermont. So the map on the right, areas that are in blue are saving money. Areas that are in that kind of reddy-orange shading would be losing money. As you can see, annually, these wouldn't be huge cost differences for everybody in Vermont, maybe $30 in either direction, more likely $15 saving or losing. But the reason why most of it looks like you're losing is what I said before, that most residential households will be paying more. What's not pictured here are the commercial vehicles, who would be likely saving more money. And these are averages across these grids. So there's people in here who could be saving money and losing money. But the big finding is that rural households, generally speaking, when you look at this map, and if you know a bit about Vermont cities, would have smaller cost increases than urban households. That's a pretty big finding. Most people think that if you live in a rural area, you are going to be eaten by a mileage-based user fee because you're traveling so much more. But the kind of hidden context there is knowing that, okay, maybe they travel a bit more, but they tend to own, these bigger trucks. And so when you go away from something that's more dependent on fuel economy and go towards something that's purely dependent on miles, they're actually going to be relatively saving money. So the kind of big thing here is that low-income households and rural households are kind of come out as the winners with a mileage-based user fee, and that the cost increases or decreases are relatively small per year under a mileage-based user fee, about maybe $20 in each direction. If you look at the 75% of people, it would really only be at the extremes where you'd see people paying a lot more or a lot less. So overall, what do we do with all this information? we found that support for a mileage-based user fee from the survey can be increased if you actually tell people how much they're going to be paying. A lot of people think, okay, if I live in a rural area, I'm going to be paying a lot more. But that, like I showed you before, isn't actually true. You're actually probably going to be paying a bit less. So presenting people with real cost information can be a huge way to gain support. Also, giving them information about how their privacy can or will be protected under different mileage collection options is a really big deal too. That can also be a non-starter for a lot of people of like, I don't want you tracking me. The truth is that you don't necessarily need to track somebody for a mileage-based user fee. You can do like non-tracking type of things with odometer readings, stuff like that. And then also informing people about some of the equity implications of mileage-based user fees can be a good way to gain support too. And finally, it would be really important as the state of Vermont moves forward with considering mileage-based user fees to consider separating them for residential and commercial households to maintain revenue neutrality for both groups. If we know that with one mileage-based user fee, residential households are on average going to be paying more, that's not great, right? We want to keep that at the average. On average, people would be paying $0 more in residential households. So having separate mileage-based user fees that retain revenue neutrality for both groups could be really important as we look at the future of this policy. That's it. Thank you very much.
So Greg and Claire, if you want to come up and answer questions, there's one in the back.
I've got two questions. One, when you did this, did you consider the weight of the vehicle and its road wear when you assigned a cost per mile?
No, so this was just a flat mileage-based user fee, so it's the same for every vehicle, but do you want to?
Yeah, so it's a common question, not the first that's asked it. So you're right that really heavy vehicles are responsible for the majority of sort of the wear and tear on the roadways. But that's we're talking about the really heavy-duty vehicles. But it's also important to understand that this revenue that's collected through a mileage-based use fee, the gas tax, currently pays for far more than just paving projects, right? Replacing bridges that have largely been degraded from salt and just over time, they're way past the useful lives. So culvert project on I-89, there's a lot of things that have really little to do with the weight of the vehicles. But you're right, there's a number of states who have separate weight and distance fees.
Well, the second question I had was, how about people who don't get inspections or there's no way to know how much they travel, like out-of-staters?
Yes. So there are different ways to collect the fee, and this is where all the trade-offs come through, right? Simplest, least invasive things to do what we just did is use odometer readings as part of an inspection. And if people skip their inspection, I mean, we just need some way to compel them to do that. But that's accounting for the out-of-state travel, that comes down to, well, you got to know where people are a little more, and that gets into the privacy thing. So there's this trade-off of more accurately tracking where people are to charge them just for the in-state travel versus maintaining privacy. And you might be paying New Hampshire some tax on top of paying Vermont for your driving in New Hampshire as well. So
There's also kind of, just to add on to that, there's this idea of like moving forward together with a mileage-based user fee, where if there was if every state had one, that wouldn't really be an issue if you're out of state. So some states, like I know Connecticut, which gets so many people traveling through from Massachusetts to New York and back, is looking at this kind of thing in collaboration with those states so that they can still get the people who are traveling on their roads. So it's kind of like a state-specific issue depending on how many people that you get traveling in and out. But it is something that people are looking at addressing.
So that's the non-starter for me on this notion, is that 25% of our tax receipts in the state are from out of state or from non-Vermont licensed cars. And so how are you going to put it all just on Vermonters? As much as I support use-based assessment, I'd be curious if in your research you're also looking at what many other states are doing and have been doing since the dawn of civilization, which is tolls. Toll by plate. All of our neighboring states are doing that. I'm not saying just on interstates, I'm saying for out-of-state cars using toll by plate recognition and submitting a bill on a quarterly basis to vehicles that, especially commercial vehicles, when they hit a certain degree of threshold of usage, sending a bill that way. Have you ventured into that topic area at all?
We have not, no. We were mostly focusing on mileage-based user fees because they have such a like political ground right now. There's so many states that are looking at them. And it's something that Vermont is already considering for electric and hybrid vehicles. So we wanted to say, take it a step farther. What would it be like for every vehicle? That's what this research focused on.
And two other, just quick to your point. So out-of-state vehicles, we can still charge them gas tax. There's technologies, RFID tags or car stuff to disable the gas tax for people. You can also have an opt-in scheme to either, there's ways to transition. So you can still collect some of that out-of-state revenue there. But yeah, toll-by-plate technology can be used to do, there's a number of schemes, the pilot programs in Oregon and California too, have a transponder that just tracks odometer, your mileage accumulation within state, and disables the collection of that out of state, so you're only paying for driving in state. There are various technologies to try to, deal with these leakage issues. But we have not looked at mileage, the various tolls.
And I do talk about some of that in my research. I was just doing like the quick version today.
Claire, you may have said this, but just to clarify, the 2 cents per mile, that covers just the Vermont portion of the gas tax, not the federal.
Yes, this would be a state replacement, yeah. But it doesn't change much with the federal, if you include the federal either. It would be also about 2 cents a mile.
I missed how you surveyed the individuals, and it sounds like your survey work was pretty unique and creative, a little bit different than our traditional survey mechanisms, and especially just, I'd love to hear more about the belief side of things too, that maybe another time.
The quick answer to the beliefs is that we gave people like that Likert scale of like how much do you agree with this sentence based on just a bunch of different factors, how they feel about the environment, government, technology, stuff like that, and then created factors that describe people and looked at the impact of those factors.
Yeah, you must have something in your greater research about just like why you decided to do the feeling side of things.
Yeah, it turned out to be a really important factor
Yeah.
in how people vote is just how they feel about things, totally unrelated to the
Right,
policy.
which is, I think we can see it across the globe right now. So just the way you guys surveyed, how did you, so Vermont, Maine?
Yeah, so we use Qualtrics. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with Qualtrics, but it's like a surveying platform. You contract with them, they pay people about like $5 or $6 to take your survey, and they can get you a certain number of responses. So they couldn't guarantee as many responses as we wanted in Vermont, so we expanded it to New Hampshire and Maine because they have like similar kind of geographies and demographics as Vermont. But yeah.
Yeah, so this was a quota sampling scheme that we used a contractor to do to get us, a demographically and socioeconomically sort of representative sample, but it's not random sampling. And then to the travel behavior questions, so that we asked that too, face questions. There's been decades of research showing that people's attitudes and beliefs are really strongly linked, you could imagine, to a number of things, but includes where you live, how you drive, and all that. And what, in our greater stream of research out of this, we're looking at how travel behavior varies across small and rural communities and different types of things. And the variation in attitudes and beliefs is a stronger indicator of how people are behaving rather than where they live, which is a little bit surprising. And then, of course, those two things are kind of moving together too a little bit. But we're trying to tease apart all that.
We have 2 minutes left. Any final questions? I had a question. In your survey design, you said, I think after you asked the original question, you showed them how much they would pay and see if that changed their mind. It seemed to change quite a few minds, but I think you mentioned on average people are going to pay more, or more households will pay more than less.
Yeah.
So how did that work in the survey?
Yeah, so it was less important for the purposes of the survey whether we presented them with an accurate estimate, just how they felt they would pay more or less. So the factors in the model were, am I paying more or less? And then we wanted to see how those factors influence policy support. So it was less important for the individual, if that makes sense.
My only question is that most people are paying, is this the question, like most people are paying more, so it's most likely people learned they were paying more, and still, you saw it went more to policy support.
Yeah.
And I think, part of that is also that I think people don't understand, well, I'm not paying that much more perhaps. I mean, we just finished this up like weeks ago, so there's more to look at.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about $20, $30 one way or the other, and I think.
And that's at the extremes. For most people, it would probably be closer to 10 or 15 in either direction.
Yeah, and you do think about a lot of our community members that are living out pretty far, and the gas that the cost they're paying for their vehicles right now. I would have thought it would be a lot more.
Yeah, and there are those extremes in the data set too of people who are paying like what I consider insane amounts of money in gas taxes. But again, through our analysis, we were able to look at just the kind of like the middle 75%. There would be some people who would be paying, say, maybe up to $400 more a year. But that's like one person in Vermont. Most people would see that $10 to $15 difference.
And I think another surprising finding was just the lack of understanding about how the gas tax works. What it's even used for, and that is not a sales tax, that's an excise tax. It's on the quantity. Because that's, when you see high prices, you think you're paying a percentage of that. So let's have a gas tax holiday. But right, it's a few bucks compared to the per mile cost of your car insurance. This is nothing. And so that I think was, I asked the students in my class that I'm teaching this semester, about this, and they're all so surprised at how little the gas tax they're paying actually is in relation to the other costs of owning a car, paying for insurance, and everything else in their lives. Which I think just informing people about that, can really modify support for changing these things. For just, all right, it's not a huge expense, and they're tweaking the way that they collect it. Maybe that's.
On that note, like most people thought that the gas tax had been increased in the past 2 years, which is just not true. And they thought that across like all 3 states. Some of these states haven't increased their gas tax in 10 to 12 years. So it's just really revealing about kind of like how personal this seems to so many people. And it's just how little people know about what they're actually voting on before you present them with education.
Well, thank you both for presenting. Feel free to stay after.